Okay. All right.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Leona, and on the behalf of everyone at Better Read Than Dead, we're so excited to see you on Zoom to celebrate Royce Kurmelovs' new release, Just Money. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you would not like to be filmed, please turn off your camera settings. Before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. These will be different depending on where you're zooming in from. For me, it is the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that Better Read Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And now on to Just Money, which is a timely and important book that shines a light on the cycle of debt Australia is trapped in. From Robodebt to rising house prices, years of political opportunism and rapacious business practices have led to the lucky country becoming one of the most indebted in the world. Royce Kurmelovs is an award-winning journalist whose work has been featured by the ABC, CNN, the BBC and The Guardian. He's also the author of best-selling and critically acclaimed books, The Death of Holden, Rogue Nation and Boom and Bust. Tonight, Royce is joined by Jericho. Greg is a columnist on economics and politics for Guardian Australia, and he was awarded the prestigious Walkley Award in 2016. We will be doing a Q&A, so if you'd like to pose a question to Royce or Greg, you can write your question into the chat box and Greg will read them out during the Q&A. We are so pleased to welcome Royce and Greg tonight on Zoom. Please let us know if you would like to purchase a copy of Just Money by emailing or calling us in store. Without further ado, here's Greg to kick things off.
Thank you, Leonie. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yes, we'll just hold up the book, Just Money. This is what we're here for. It's an excellent and extremely timely book. It's one of those books which I think would have been tough to write for Royce, not just because of the personal experiences he went through while writing it, but it's one of those topics where as you're writing it, you'd be waking up every day and seeing another news story and thinking, oh God, I've got another chapter to write, because it's a book that really delves into how debt actually works in Australia. I think the really good thing about the book is, as an economics writer, I'm always writing about debt, but it's always in fairly abstracty terms. I'm talking about debt to GDP ratios, and I'll look at housing prices and house loans and whether credit growth has increased or not. And it's all a bit sterile. And the great thing about Royce's book is that it's certainly not sterile. It is right on the ground in the actual, I guess, would almost call it a debt war, given how our economy is structured. And while I'm giving a bit of an ad for the book in that way, what I think what really drew me into it about it was the personal stories in there. And I think, Royce, if we can just, for those of you who in the audience who haven't actually read the book, if you could just give a quick sort of recap of the experiences that you went through that actually kind of started the whole book, when you basically had the kind of accident people, and certainly myself, get cold sweats just thinking about and hoping doesn't happen to them, but it actually happened to you.
Yeah, and look, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Yeah, it's very nice of you to say. I guess you're right, the book did start from a bad day. I mean, the very short explanation is I had a car accident. And then after that very bad day was over, a few months later, I got a bill in the mail for $25,000 and a demand from an insurance company to buy the other person that I hit a new car. It was a lot of money to me at the time. I was and I remain a precariously employed freelancer. You know, I work for a variety of places, try to keep going. And so for me, this was a huge, I guess, shock to the system. I guess the one thing I'm really grateful of is no one got hurt in that moment. No one was injured, which was great. But I didn't have insurance to cover it, so that meant I was on the hook for the lot. And from there, basically, what began was a process of investigating this, to investigate this debt and make sure this company were doing their homework, that their math was correct. And what I found was that they weren't. And then through that, over time, I began to learn more about debt, and like you said, debt in this country and how it works. I'd be able to understand more clearly about this kind of experience that a lot of other people out there also have and deal with every day.
It's something that most people don't actually deal with at the coalface, is the consequences of all our credit cards, all our loans. Most people do pay them off or keep them at least under some sort of control. What was the feeling like for you when you were confronted with a debt collector, which is a fairly intimidating kind of process, something that certainly I'm not sure if I'd know how to respond to? You seem to, my gathering from the book, you were able to actually draw, though, on both your experience as a journalist in knowing sort of, I guess, the interview process and how that works and how people are trying to get information out of each other, and also your legal background. Would that be right?
Absolutely. And I should say as well that, I did have a visit from a debt collector, specifically a field agent, which is actually very rare for a lot of people. That only happens when, when all other options have been exhausted and they have to send someone out to find you. And I should say as well that although I did have advantages in dealing with this situation, I, like a lot of other people, was shit scared. I mean, it's intimidating having someone there asking questions about your circumstances and who you are. And I stumbled into it naively, not knowing that I was going into this interaction. But I should also say clearly that, like, once we kind of got to the bottom of it, I wasn't sure why this guy was there, and he wasn't sure why he was there, because technically at that point in the interaction, I hadn't actually accepted the debt. But like you say, because I had the advantages of having a legal education, because I had the advantages of having worked as a journalist and understanding some of the tricks and ploys it takes to get information, and that any information spoken to an agent is on the record and can be used in court, I was able to brace myself and, shut down some of those nerves and deal with this in a way that didn't disadvantage myself. And I think that became a real powerful insight across doing the whole book, is that fundamental information asymmetry and power inequality of a lot of people in these situations. When they engage with these companies or debt collectors, the people who don't have the advantage of that knowledge and experience often wind up dealing with the situation in the simplest terms. They know something's wrong. They know that this, something is, not quite right, and so they tell the person to fuck off, or they lie. And at that point, they wind up in trouble. And so that kind of fundamental class dynamic and that information asymmetry became something I wanted to highlight and show throughout the course of the book, because that's fundamentally what we're talking about here.
Yep. And I think that's something that really comes through strongly, and not from just your personal experience, but through other people who you encounter, and even just your general research of how debt is treated, is that it really is kind of the forefront of the class struggle within Australia. The sense that people with debt, or people who are in debt trouble, I guess is perhaps the way to put it, are almost viewed as having done something wrong or kind of unworthy, and most likely almost this sense that they were either stupid or almost just not responsible, weren't good citizens in a way. Was that something that kind of surprised you and was it a recurring sort of theme throughout whenever you encountered people, that they had that feeling themselves, that they were, even if it was because of, such as yours, an accident, or other situations where there's one woman in the book who's, comes from a history of, family violence, and certainly through no fault of her own found herself in debt. Is there a real guilt and shame that is carried with this debt?
Oh, absolutely. And there are two sides to this. First is that we don't often have a good language to talk about this stuff, or we don't have because we don't understand it, there's no understanding of the history or background to this. But what we do have is a kind of inherited sense of the guilt and morality associated with the debt that is, locked into the very language. The words we have for debt come from like old German words that mean guilt. The words we have for credit, which is the nicer version of debt, come from old French words and old Latin words, which are used for things like the credo, the Italian profession of faith. So the association between debt, guilt, and morality has a long 1,000-year history that is tied up with ideas about spirituality, religion, morality, and then in contemporary times, this idea of personal responsibility. And that ties into kind of fundamental economic concepts of, the individual, the average person, as a rational optimizer who goes through every aspect of their life, optimizing their affairs in the most rational way. And as we know, humans don't do this. People are rational, but they're constrained. They're constrained by resources, time, information. Having to take the kids to wherever. Like, these things prevent people from acting accordingly. And this is why we have the division of labor. So this fundamental idea that the average person can handle their personal finances perfectly, always, wherever they are, is at the heart of how we've built this kind of financial system on the back of that, which fundamentally operates on this idea of buyer beware.
And I mean, you raised a number of things which we will be coming to, for those of you, certainly aspects of Robodebt we'll be getting to, and also I love your description of credit and debt, which is something that the government itself made use of this week. Just on the classism aspect, it's even in some ways more insidious than that. It's even if you do act rationally, there is a real sense that the system is rigged against you because of the financial system and the way it operates, and the power imbalance is such that even if you are a rational actor and think you're doing the right thing, you can get caught up. And even if you are actually in the right, the way the legal system, the financial system is set up, there's almost, it's biased against your actual being able to find redress. And I just want to draw attention in the book, you highlight the case of Westpac and its writing of home loans that relied on, how would you describe HEM? I mean, the household expenditure measure.
So it's the HEM model, which was an automated system for helping mortgage brokers write mortgages very quickly. It operated it was basically a computerized model that, if I remember correctly, allowed them to plug in your expenses and work out where you were in certain tiers of expenditure, and then allocate, say, okay, well, you can borrow this much. And by relying on that average, they weren't actually dealing with your expenses or your situation. They were putting you into a certain class of persons and making decisions accordingly.
Yeah, and the case when Westpac did have to negotiate a settlement, but the actual judgment by Justice Perham in the case was quite instructive of how the whole system is viewed from those or towards those who have any sort of debt. He wrote, or in his summary, he wrote, I may eat Wagyu beef every day washed down with the finest Shiraz, but if I really want my new home, I can make do on much more modest fare. And then later, the fact that the consumer spends $100 per month on caviar throws no light on whether a given loan will put the consumer into circumstances of substantial hardship. It was this, it's kind of like, what universe is he operating in that even just such a sort of cavalier kind of examples would be considered appropriate when talking about people who are struggling to pay their home loans, and who's basically told the bank some things which, there wasn't a heck of a lot of detail required to support their assertions of how much they spent each month, and suddenly they were being offered loans which were well beyond their scope. Really, is it seems to me it's a thing. The problem with debt in this country is not so much that we have so much of it, it's that there is just this real snobbishness towards it, of this belief that I think it goes back to this thing that, you know, good people don't get into debt. However, if you are wealthy enough, you can play with the debt or play with the system and the system's rules to be able to cope with debt.
Absolutely. And I mean, that judgment was, I guess, profound in the sense that it plays into a broader, massive systematic change that has taken place over the last 30 years. And like, you know, the really boring name for this stuff is macroeconomic regimes. And the very simple version is, after World War II, you had certain institutions that meant that even if you made a mistake, even if you screwed up, even if you weren't perfect with your finances, you still got along pretty well. I mean, you had socialized healthcare, socialized public housing, you had guaranteed wage rises, all these things. And then in the 80s, we unmade that and remade it in a different way. And the way we lent loans changed as well. And then so now we've ended up in a situation where all those institutions that used to support the average person have been stripped away. And then in the meantime, the focus has been purely on incomes. So long as your income can support this, that's fine. You can have your, you can have whatever house you want. The problem with that is that it fundamentally makes everything fragile, because mistakes become increasingly costly as time goes on, and you may not have the extra slack to be able to cover the cost of those errors. But the more we go on, the more we're tracking in that direction. And so what it creates is inherent fragility into the entire system. And that case you point out was so interesting, because what it did is it fundamentally tied that approach to lending into the wider political system in the same way the Harvester judgment incorporated the idea of a minimum wage. So I mean, it's very much a sign of the times.
Again, you know, the book is so tightly wed. We've got today with over in America, Donald Trump's tax returns, and we see that he is, and this is something you actually raise in the book, where if more than anything, the tax returns, apart from revealing that he's probably as dodgy as all hell when it comes to
everything,
shall we say, claiming deductions, is that he is the king of debt. He is one who operates in a system where he kind of uses debt for his own advantage, because he has perhaps the power, perhaps the finances to be able to get away with it in a manner in which no one else does. And one of the interesting things you point out in this book, which had certainly not occurred to me in my sort of the coverage of politics and economics that I do, is in some ways a bit of a link between Pauline Hanson and Donald Trump, in that how Trump really set himself up as, you know, when Hillary Clinton labeled him as the king of debt, she thought he was, you know, she was really nailing him, whereas it was almost that actually he embraced it, and there was this view amongst certainly his voters of, well, yeah, that's how the system is, and he's clever about it. And also you point out how Pauline Hanson really keyed into debt as a political issue in Australia, which I really hadn't seen raised before. What was your take on Hanson's approach?
Well, I think it goes back to how we think about politics, right? Like, people act because of stories, and the stories we tell about ourselves. And so I think, and actually we should also be clear, it's not just Trump and Hanson. There's also a version of this on the left. Syriza did the same thing, but with government debt in Athens during the Greek financial crisis. Bernie Sanders did the same thing with his campaign. He was promising to wipe out medical debt and student debt, which is an incredibly powerful message. And so I guess what was so interesting about this is, once you start looking at the landscape through this realm of debt and through finance, these issues that start to seem somehow disparate and isolated become related. And it's just the thing with Trump and Hanson is that they're idiots. They're not part of these institutions. They don't read books. They don't understand the etiquette or the conversations or the way to have these conversations. They turn up and say the obvious thing, or what they think is the obvious thing, right? And some of that is some really racist stuff. And that is true. That's a core part of who they are. But then also, they occasionally turn up and say something really, really obvious, like, hey, that's really unfair. So when you have a situation in Queensland leading up until that election period where Hanson comes to power, you have the situation of a multi-year-long drought. You have farmers who are actively protesting and organizing. You have the Shut the Gate movement protesting against the fracking. Water becomes this huge issue. Who has it and who doesn't? And then associated with that, who can pay their bills and who don't? Because the way we lend the money is tied to the value of the property, and with no water, those properties collapse. And so, and then you see this taking place just as Hanson starts their campaign. And unlike others, thanks to the influence of another farmer from Western Australia who was written off as a clown on the national landscape, and that is accurate. He was. I've met the man. I can say that with full objectivity. But the one thing he did was turn her onto this idea that debt and the banks were an issue. And so so that becomes a core part of her platform, and that gets her support, as well as Bob Catter, the Independent. And then we all wonder where these people are coming from, because they're the only ones saying, hey, these debts you hold are a problem. And both the major parties have so far only offered you loans to get out of your debt. In other words, you're solving a debt crisis with more debt. And I think today that's really illustrative for 2 points. First, with the current news of Donald Trump, which could go either way, depending how it's used. Either you have a millionaire tax avoider who lies like he breathes, or you have a guy who's, or for the people who don't follow politics, they have a story about a president who's in debt and managed to become president. That's like the ultimate, that's the ultimate story of self-actualization. So, and that's going to play out in the next coming days. And I think that the same story is happening now, when a lot of government programs post the pandemic are, okay, you're in trouble, we're going to do a financial-led recovery. Let's cure this crisis with more debt. We're going to make loans more accessible. Yesterday, I was tipped to the fact that there was an arts program that was offering loans to small arts companies that are moderated through commercial banks, but guaranteed by the government. But ultimately, the solution is always debt cures the crisis. And then we wonder why people get really angry and vote for whoever else turns up.
And and certainly this isn't a new thing. Without doing the whole Godwin law type thing, Hitler in the 1930s pretty much really came to prominence by pointing out foreign debt and predicting what would happen when US banks went bust and wanted the money back. And it was, even though, it was sort of stop clock kind of thing, it's amazing how prevalent debt is at such times, and fringe groups will very much look to debt as a powerful weapon. And you're right, it is quite interesting that the major powers perhaps have kind of overlooked them. Perhaps that's because they can't see the system, or outside the system perhaps.
Well, and actually there was a really good study released recently that I saw from some European researchers. When they ran the numbers in terms of austerity, what they found was those Germans in certain parts of the country that were most hit by the then conservative government's austerity budget, that is, they were being told to tighten their belts, and that they were responsible for their finances and had to pay back their money, were the ones most likely to vote for the Nazis when Hitler came to power. And to me, there was another book all about this called Austerity: It's the History of a Dangerous Idea. And the takeaway is that from history we learn that austerity is bad news. It gave us Imperial Japan, it gave us Nazi Germany, and now we're kind of just blindly stumbling down the same track. Yeah,
and I think that gets us into and this goes on from your broader point about the changing economy since the 1980s, but I feel like it is really, it's gone on steroids of late. And certainly we saw that with the Robodebt scandal, and just the entire operation of this, essentially going from what we saw in the 80s and through to the 90s was a transference of public debt to private debt, where whether it be corporate or personal, the sense that the economy is generally powered by debt of some sort. And as you say, in the post-World War II era, it was public debt because there were public services being offered and public housing and public socialized health. And then we transferred that to the private sector. And so you were able, as Peter Costello, to say, look at us, we're debt-free, whereas, of course, all that had happened was all that debt had gone into the private sector. But what really has changed with the Robodebt and the way in which Centrelink has been operated is not just such a transfer of the public debt to the private sphere, but then the public debt operating in a sense like debt collectors, as bringing on that sort of the private sector side of things, and with it bringing a new kind of debt and something that is, I can't think of any historical sort of occurrence where you had people in debt not because of an accident or a foolish error or just bad luck, but something where at the time no one thought anything had occurred incorrectly or wrongly. Both sides were happy to transfer the money and were not expecting anything to come of it, and finding out that 5 years, 6 years after the fact, they're suddenly in debt. Was there a difference in the experience of people you found who were confronted with a robo-debt or these type of debts compared to those who, like yourself, had just kind of stuffed up or had a run of bad luck?
Absolutely, and I think you're right right in all of that. I mean, what made the Robodebt, I want to say scandal, so compelling and so important is that it symbolized and captures all these changes to our society over so many years. I mean, fundamentally, the social security system has been made to function with a financial logic, you know, and I maintain that the social security system should not run like a Wall Street trading floor. And essentially what it did was it served as a tax on upward social momentum. So for people who were in trouble, who were long-term unemployed, who were young, who were students, who were starting out, they were who were reliant on social security. If they got off of it, got a job, did better with their lives, did better for themselves, in 5 years later they turned around and were suddenly hit with a whopping great debt that they had no idea how it was made, where it came from, or what the detail was. And to top it off, the department would routinely not provide the numbers on this. They would not provide the calculation sheets, so they would not prove how it was worked. And then it was the conversation that flew out of that was so important, is that sense of that's the refusal, at least, to admit in politics that there was any problem, because the proposition was always, if there's a debt, it should be repaid, but so on, so and so. Over time, it's come to be proven that the entire system, that the entire operation of that scheme was illegal. It was known from very early on. There were 70 AAT decisions that told the government this was illegal, and yet it was maintained anyway. But what it served to do was trap a whole age dynamic in a Byzantine labyrinth of bureaucracy and indebtedness that they could not escape. And it made them angry, and they fought back. And I think that is the compelling part of the story, the sense that they organized and fought back on this scheme, and they have achieved some result. As much as it's been frustrating, they've got somewhere. And I think that's a really important, uplifting aspect to the story.
Yeah, I'll just remind everyone, if you do have any questions, just to type them in the chat, and in 10 minutes or so we'll get onto those. And even if people, I'm not sure if we can unmute them, but we'll see how it goes. One of the other aspects of the Robodebt and just how it's all operating, I think, that is striking, is we've got a government department, and in effect a government itself, operating kind of like an insurance company or a bank, which are universally hated by the public because you are viewed just as a serial number, or there's no one, even though all the adverts from insurance companies and banks are about how we'll treat you as people and individuals, the reason why they have those adverts is because they know people know that's a load of bullshit. You don't need to advertise that you're a nice people if people already think you are. And there was this great quote you had from a Centrelink worker, and it's something which I don't think people are quite aware of, just how Centrelink there's this view of Centrelink and the Department of Social Security, I forget what it's called now, DSS. Yeah. It's not just you ring up and, people think, oh, I have to ring up and I'm left on hold and everything, but they've actually got essentially debt collectors, people being employed to ring up and essentially deal with people's debt. And there's a great quote from a guy called Sam who or it's not actually his quote, but your sort of reference, where identifying a debt is the easiest thing in the world, Sam says, if the person investigating doesn't think much about the person at the other end. A lot of people who work here, they don't care about the people who call in. It's all about the stats, which is an incredible line for someone from the public sector to be talking about, isn't it? It's a real shift from the government and the public sector being there to assist to the public sector being there to basically raise money, in a sense, raise a profit.
Absolutely, and that was how that scheme was conceived. It was conceived to claw back something like $1.6 billion from essentially poor people, and then there were stunning visual representations of this. There was the photographs of the whiteboards in Centrelink office that got leaked out to the press, and those whiteboards were in a lot of different offices across the country. When I spoke to people, their response was to shrug and say, "Yeah, we've had to deal with them for a long time." Because ultimately this was about a revenue raising scheme, and I think the flaws of that have been shown recently in the pandemic, when it was when suddenly suddenly you have thousands of people that are unemployed all trying to log on at the same time, and the whole system crashes under the demand. I mean, because on top of this, and I think this little fact tells you everything you need to know about this story. The Centrelink website was built to handle 6,000 concurrent users. And at the same time, they were telling everyone, like the instruction was, just go online to deal with your debt, deal with your issue, apply for your thing. That's fine until you had 100,000 people on one day and the whole thing blew up. And I guess learning the extent of that and hearing that from, like you said, the inside, I think was shocking to me. And it was just more evidence about how much this financialized thinking has penetrated our basic social institutions.
Yeah, and you have a great quote from then Social Services Minister, a person by the name of Scott Morrison, who told in a speech at a national conference of the Australian Council of Social Service, "What I am basically saying is that welfare must become a good deal for investors, for private investors." I mean, that's an astonishing approach to social security, but also to private debt and the government's role within that. And as I say, this book won't unfortunately become, well, fortunately for you, but unfortunately for society, it's not about to become irrelevant anytime soon, given that we've seen just this week the government's approach to the recovery from the pandemic is to lower lending standards. Lending standards that came out of the global financial crisis, and which we had a royal commission that showed that banks, when left to their own devices, don't do well. And we have now, once again, the government specifically saying that we need to transfer the the responsibility, I should say, from the banks to the public and go to a buyer beware system. I mean, I just can see you needing volume 2 after this, basically.
And that's, I guess, one of the harder things to explain about debt in clear terms, because it is so abstract. To think less about debt in terms of moral dynamic, in terms of good or bad, and to think about it as a broader process of risk shifting. That is, the deliberate and conscious decision to transfer the risk associated with any given action from government and corporations onto the average person, and then the bait and switch involved in that, and saying that when something goes wrong, that's on you, buddy. Don't come crying to us when it all goes terribly wrong. And that's what we're talking about. And this is, I guess, one of the importance of learning and understanding about this stuff, because finance gets away with this is because we don't understand how it works. We don't understand what's happening at the very forefront of financial thinking and logic. The ability to take one lot of debts, see it as one big risk, to run the numbers and then break that down into little risks, price it, and then sell it accordingly as more flexible loans or a flexible phone contract. These are the things that are happening and are placing incredible stress on, the household budget. And we talked about how this is a class issue, and it breaks down that way. So for people who are, on the lower end of the income spectrum, they have less money to get less debts, but the debts they do have cause more problems in the short term. People with the most debt overall are those middle-income households who have been made to saddle this. And when you look at this, it explains a lot. So when we have surveys of asking people, how do you feel about your incomes and about your life and everything going on? You're earning more than ever, isn't it great? The results come back saying, well, actually, no, I'm working harder than ever, and I feel like I have nothing to show for it. I'm just dead tired. And then we wonder why people feel that way, and we put it down to various individual causes. But I guess in the last few days, watching those developments, that decision to open the flow of credits as a way to revive the economy. I can't say I'm surprised, but it's still a strange feeling watching that play out, even as I've been talking and thinking about it for a few months and years.
We've got a few questions that relate to this, so I'll move into them a little bit. Manda and Melanie actually talking about these lending standards and being a bit confused because it is confusing, and it's confusing because it is purposefully made to be so. All the press releases this week from the government didn't mention debt at all. There was no mention whatsoever of debt. It was about easing credit standards, making credit easier, which sounds really great, but one person's credit is another person's debt. And I guess you're right in saying that how would we say that what is bad about it is the responsibility that has been changed. I guess you'd say, Royce, is that what is the arguing is that it was too hard to get a loan for a business, and to be honest, there were some minor aspects where there were rare situations where it was difficult to obtain a credit card and the government even gave this one situation which is accurate, but it was of a pensioner whose husband had died and the credit card had been in both their names, and now she couldn't get a credit card because she didn't have an income and all this, but she did have $430,000 in the bank. So, the common situations like that, there are some barriers that perhaps could do with some lowering, but essentially what the change in the standards is about is essentially changing it to you should, as the person taking out a loan, be able to determine whether or not you can afford this loan, and if you can't, well, you should have known better, which is pretty well. There's a reason why Westpac, on the same day that this was announced, Westpac had to was handed down a massive billion-dollar fine, multi-billion-dollar fine, and yet their share price went up 7% on this day on the back of these changes to lending standards. And generally, when you've got shares in banks all going up 5 to 7% on the back of a government policy change, that's not because it's going to make life harder for banks, shall we say. Would that be your kind of view, Royce?
Yeah, and I think the issue is, and this is why it gets confusing, right? Because the issue, if you start off from the idea that debt in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, sometimes you need to take out a loan to buy stuff. However, when you encourage people to take out a lot of debts, particularly at a time when incomes are stagnant or falling, as we are in now, what you're doing is you're setting everyone up for a bad time. And that's the issue we're talking about here, the underlying fragility you're building into a system that is already fragile. So if we think back to the start of the pandemic, when everything got really crazy and all blew up, it felt like there was this collapse that things were just packing up, things were shuttering. But that's what we're talking about in terms of fragility, this sense that this pyramid of credit may collapse and we all get swept up in it. And the problem with the announcement recently is that in trying to solve what is essentially a debt crisis with more debt, you're just doubling down on the same issue. In the past, when we run into these sorts of big system-changing moments, we've sat down and thought about, right, how do we redesign this in a way that solves these problems, for the most people for the long run? We haven't done that. All we're doing is doing more of the same, and that's bad news.
And I think one of the reasons people don't understand just why this is wrong and why banks, perhaps why it is viewed that this is a good thing for banks, that it's lower lending standards. You think, well, why would anyone think that banks being able to take out sort of dodgy loans or loans that might not be able to be repaid be bad? It's that the risk for banks is much less than, or the consequences of the risk for you not paying your loan are much less for the bank than for you, because what the banks will do is essentially what they did, and this led to the GFC, is they bundle up all your mortgages into a nice bond issue, which is rated, because there's thousands of mortgages in there, the risks of everyone not paying back their mortgage or everyone defaulting on their mortgage is low. And so it's actually not that big of a risk for the banks to do it. In fact, it's quite profitable. It was very profitable prior to the GFC until everyone did stop paying off their mortgages in America. And the other aspect is, it's not always coming straight from the banks. There are other financial intermediaries who are doing this, who are then passing on the debt to others, who are then selling off that debt to others. And so there's a real disconnect between the person taking out the loan and the person offering the loan. And it's not like it's sitting with them, it's going off somewhere else in the system. And when you also combine that with a system where the people who are you're meeting for a loan are being given incentives to write loans and to approve loans, that's where they start going from being your old version of, certainly when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, of your bank manager has basically been a fairly trusted figure in the community. I grew up in a small country town, and the bank manager was, a fairly highly regarded person. The person would be on council boards and things like this, whereas they changed from being that to someone who is selling you something, trying to sell you the idea that you can afford this, and kind of pushes that. And it's something that leads to a fair degree of stress in the system if the underlying economics are not great. And the obvious thing is the underlying economics are not great at the moment, and yet we've decided let's dive back into it. It's insane.
And if we translate this down into the experience of the average person, right? Like you don't experience these ideas as these big abstract ideas. You experience this as, I've lost my job, I'm trying to renegotiate my loan, and they won't, and they will give me a bigger loan, or there's little details. And then when the issue is when it comes to the crunch, when suddenly you're unable to make those payments, when suddenly you're unable to keep up, or and the bank's looking to foreclose, suddenly you have to talk to debt collectors. Suddenly you're looking at your house being sold, because Australia runs a system of recourse lending where you're on the hook for the difference between the sale price and the purchase price. Suddenly these bills start stacking up because there's this cascading effect of things just going wrong that you don't understand. And the way you process this is to think, well, the system is rigged against me. And in some ways it kind of is, because every interaction has been thought through well before you even walk in the door of your local bank, right? There's a script for how to approach it. If you want this product or this product, and how to set in how to direct you to one or the other. And I think what it ultimately leads to is a society of people who are increasingly angry, increasingly confused, and fundamentally smaller and weaker as a result of it, because of the interaction of all these disparate things you never ordinarily think about.
Yep. Amanda's just, and I'm not 100% sure on this, where she's asked, isn't mortgage insurance meant to protect our house from a financial crisis? if mortgage insurance is, trying to think, that's more if you're, I'm not sure you can insure your own mortgage repayments. I think it's more if you're, as an investor, mortgage insurance can cover when a renter is not, I'm not 100% sure on that, but it is also a case, it's, you know, insurance. Are you aware of how mortgage insurance works, Royce?
You know, the easiest thing would be like, check the contract, because it will be there, and whether it covers acts of God and whether an economic recession is one of them depends. I'm not sure how otherwise the technical aspects of insurance, and I should say, I'm not a financial counselor, cannot give you financial advice on that. If you do, there are a lot of people that can help you. There's a lot of free services that the government run. Don't pay for it. You're being ripped off if you are. But double check the fine print, double check with the institution, and see what's what. And if you're in trouble, call the National Debt Helpline.
Actually, just on that, it's an interesting thing with the DSS and operators like that, that they don't see themselves as the person who should be giving advice like that of how you should, who you should seek to help, is it? They're not ringing up and saying, oh, you should go to the ombudsman about this or anything like that, are they?
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's part of, I mean, you'd call it the hustle. That's part of the interaction. So their job is not to provide you information where you can get resources for help. I think we were talking about this before, and I told a story about someone I spoke to who worked as in a call center in a debt collection agency. They ultimately got fired because while they're on the phone, they were just doing it to make make a living. But the more stories they heard of people who were just in financial distress, that they were pressing to pay their bills, eventually they started saying, hey, maybe you want to give a call to the ombudsman. Here's the number. Maybe you want to call this hotline for help. And that lasted about 3 months before their manager called in the office and said, maybe this is not the right fit for you. And they said, yeah, maybe you're right. But and it goes back to that fundamental asymmetry with a lot of these organizations. I was looking at the chat box as well, and there's a comment from someone talking about the focus on government debts and the government budget over private debt. And I think I think that's actually a really good observation, because over the last 10 years, the rhetoric and the political conversation has been very much about the government budget, but that very often uses a political weapon when at the same time there's this huge other situation building in, as you said, in the private sector. And I'm wondering if you have more to talk about on that, Greg.
Yeah, I mean, it's been something that I've been writing about for a long time now. Pretty much since Keating was the first one to really, I mean, it'd been sort of around for a long time, but Keating was, because he actually was able to balance the budget, was the first who really started talking about balanced budgets as good. But Peter Costello and John Howard really kicked that into overdrive. And it reached the stage by 2007 where that was almost viewed as the economy was the budget. If the budget's in surplus, then the government's doing a good job with the economy. And it's a complete disconnect from reality. We don't get the budget surplus. It was almost treated as though the surplus was profit and somehow we all got a dividend payout. We don't get a dividend payout when there's a surplus. It means they're taking more money out of the economy than they're putting back, which might be fine in the very rare occasion of a mining boom where you do have masses of private money, slushing around the economy. But most of our history, certainly since World War II, the government has been needed to kind of fill the gap of the private sector to do things to keep the economy going, to provide services and so forth. And that requires running a deficit, and that leads to increasing government debt. And yet even during the GFC, Labor really struggled with this whole, we're running a deficit. That means they really couldn't get over the hump of admitting that who gives a shit, really. We're running a deficit because we're in a global financial crisis and tax revenue has gone through the floor, and it wouldn't have mattered who was running the government, they would have had a deficit exactly the same as this year. It wouldn't have mattered who was running it when you know, when unemployment suddenly soars up to 8-9%, and you know, you have to step in and suddenly pay a hell of a lot more in job seeker and so forth, you're going to have a deficit. And you would think, though, even with that, with this massive change and shift, that the government would be able to let go of the old debt is bad and deficit is bad and surplus is good. And yet, even last week, Josh Frydenberg, when he was giving a speech to the Chamber of Commerce, where he outlined, oh, we're going to be keeping on doing this sort of stimulus, and this is a bit of a spoiler, this is in my article tomorrow. Even within that, he's still saying, oh yeah, but once it gets sort of comfortably under 6% unemployment, we'll start going back to improving the budget balance and all this. And it's like, well, at that point, we're still not even back to where we were before we entered the pandemic. The unemployment rate was at 5.1%. Why are you sort of saying 6% is about where we should start putting on the brakes? This is absurd. And it's because there is this continual belief that government debt is bad, that this falling back on the, you know, the household budget myth of a government debt and government budgets. And it's this, I think, this sort of almost puritanical, I think, sort of history of debt is bad, and we can kind of sell that within the I guess the Liberal Party's fairly conservative views of not wishing to pay for public services. And so it kind of fits within their view of demonizing debt and trying not to explain to people how government debt is completely different to your private debt. Governments should have the credit card going, and they should be taking out mortgages because they have a different role to play, and their debt is completely different from your debt. And I think, and certainly it's something that I've been trying again and again and again to explain to my readers the difference, but it is a very difficult thing because it's complicated. It's economics, and
it sounds good, and it ties into that morality play, like you're saying.
It does.
It's the way, and it's used as a political cudgel, right? Like, and it's very hard to say to people, look, your household budget's not the same as the government budget, because, you know, if I was talking about my household budget, I don't own a printing press, I don't print Royce dollars, and I can't, you know, bring people into my family and then tax them for 6 generations to pay for things like aged care homes and roads. That's absurd. Like, but, you know, because it's useful to certain constituencies, the same line gets trotted out, because it's very easy to attack your opponents, no matter what side of politics they are, by asking the simple question: well, how are you going to pay for that?
Yeah.
And so it's and at the same, and you get this in different quarters. Economists often ask that to politicians, so they don't get really excited and start doing gold-plated everything, which is sometimes a valid concern. You know, a gold-plated coal plant is not a good idea right now, but, you know, and politicians use it to attack each other. And if they stop doing that, then it's no longer politically useful. So this is where the dynamics change. And this kind of bleeds into, I guess, a question from Adam, which is that, you know, do the banks have too much influence over the government's courts? ASIC. To be clear, I don't necessarily, and if I can take a chance to answer that, Greg, my assessment is not necessarily that the banks have too much control over the institutions of public life. It's that the financial services sector broadly is a money-making business. It employs a lot of people, it makes a lot of cash. If you want a good career and a good life, go into the financial services sector industry, because they have the resources to fund the lobby groups and the people who talk to government, and they have friends in government, and they can offer, you know, they have all these resources that, you know, you and I don't have as average people. And so when it comes time to write something, you know, who's really going to listen to, the person in their office or, you know, the person on Twitter? Like,
yeah. I mean, they certainly do have an outsized influence, but I'd say that about numerous sort of corporate bodies. It's just that, I mean, you know, the 4 banks are among the biggest companies in Australia, which is just kind of absurd. You know, like, even if you look in America, you know, Bank of America and those things, they're nowhere near the size of Google or Alphabet and Apple and, you know, even their oil companies and so forth. It seems we are very much a financial and debt based economy, as much as we often think of ourselves as, oh, we're all about mining. The mining sector is certainly, in terms of employment and even in terms of production, the financial sector is bigger, and it's certainly one that has grown massively over the last 40 years since the ALP opened up the banking system, which I don't particularly disagree with what they were doing, because we had a fairly slothful and protected banking sector who were, you know, not competitive at all. But it's, as with all these things, it's become far too much open slather. And the fact that, sorry, you go.
So how they did that was interesting as well, because the committee that rewrote the rules to open up the financial sector was dominated by the financial services sector, the real estate industry, the insurance industry, and the banks. So the finance sector rewrote the rules with which they were to be regulated. I forget the name of the committee now, which is going to annoy me. But you know, so the people who were, so I guess the people weren't necessarily involved in that process, and then we wound up with this open slather system. You know.
Yeah, I mean, and clearly just the fact that you've got the government lowering lending standards, given how brief a time it is since the Royal Commission into the financial services sector, just, I think, demonstrates the hold the sector does have over, perhaps not the government itself, but over the political system, and that incorporates, I think, the media. I mean, you've got the Financial Review is, in my view, not so much a paper that tries to hold the financial sector to account, but kind of sees itself as the voice of the financial sector. I mean, that's not the entire paper, but I think the editorial view, certainly we see that come across. And you would say that of certain sections of News Limited as well. And it's just a case of, if you're a journalist writing in this field, you're going to be able to get hold of, you know, the financial services sector quite easily on the phone to get a quote, to get a view. They're very powerful. I mean, the fact that the Australian Bankers Association have got Anna Bligh, a former Labor Premier, as their head is quite extraordinary. So it's not something where I think we can just say, oh, it's the Liberal Party bad and Labor's great on this or anything like that. I think it's pretty it has its tentacles throughout everything. And but I think where it really, to me, it really just struggles. The big issue is that getting away from the talk of public debt as being similar, because that actually feeds into the system quite well, because banks don't view their, you know, when banks like government's talking about private debt because they're going to make money out of it. And it's, you know, as Royce was saying, there's often worries about sort of gold plating of things, but what actually historically has happened when you just say, look at the energy sector, the gold plating occurs when you privatize systems and have regulations involved where it actually incentivizes the private sector to gold plate their things and charge the public masses amount of money for it, more than they really should do. It's not governments, you know, who are the ones who are spending too much money on beautiful, wonderful services. It's them getting the private sector to do it and forcing the public to pay for it, I think. How are we going for time? I think how are we going, Leonie?
We are pretty much in the last minute.
Oh no.
I know, it's been a ride. Like, this has been great. I've really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else has too. Don't forget, Just Money is here at Better Read Than Dead. You can come see it in the wild. You can ring us up to have a copy set aside for you. And thank you so much again to Greg and Royce. And yeah, thank you, Royce, for writing this book.
Thank you for having us, and thank you for everyone who turned out. You know,
thank you very much. Good to see you. But yeah, I just want to get across, this is not a book for, you don't need an economics degree to read this. It is very much a human interest story about a subject that is too often put in the economics category rather than actually this is about life and society. And so it's more a book about Australian society than it is actually about the economics. It just happens to be in the economic sort of sphere. So I highly recommend it. Really a great read.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.